Hi guys, so today we'll be looking at the voice type that most people are probably most familiar with, the tenor. But it is far more than just a classical voice word. So what is it? So a tenor is the highest voice classification a man can have, except from a countertenor, but I'll try my best to explain that next episode as that's a little bit different. And unlike the baritone, a tenor is really easy to identify, and there's also a lot of them in the music industry. You'll have heard several tenors before. So let's get into what actually makes a tenor voice and how would you find one. Before I go on mentioning what you get from a contemporary tenor, it's good to note that this voice type has the biggest disparity in sound between a classical and a contemporary artist. So, what I mean by that is a bass and a baritone, their thickness of their voice and the way they sound and their chest dominant heavy approach to music is quite similar with their opera singer counterparts. They're not exactly identical, but they're very similar. You can kind of tell them apart. I mean, you can tell they're similar, and they have very similar styles of singing and the deepness of their voice. With the tenor, they have a similar operatic style with the lowered larynx and the really powerful, thick, mega belty chest range. But a contemporary tenor is very often the absolute opposite of that, with a lighter tone. So as I say, it's a tenor that has by far the biggest difference in voice sounds and timbre between a classical and contemporary artist in comparison to a baritone or a bass. So that's just something worth keeping in mind, that there is a stark contrast in the way they sound. And when I say big, powerful, belty range, a classical tenor is very famous for singing the tenor high C or the C5. So an example of that would be. Where, of course, a contemporary tenor, while some may be able to do something similar to this isn't how their voice is programmed. They don't push a really heavy sound up top very often. They generally sing the lighter, kind of softer coordination. Not always, but that is kind of a stark difference to keep in mind, that obviously a contemporary tenor and a classical tenor are two rather different voices, but also share the same voice type. It's more down to the technique and the training they put in and kind of where they sing in the music industry. Obviously, a classical trained singer will be trained in a certain laryngeal style, and a contemporary trained singer will sing a different style. So that's just a way to kind of differentiate two voices. However, it is the same voice type because they still have kind of the same pre-built instruments. They just use it differently. So, how do you identify a contemporary tenor? Well, generally they have a really bright, flexible, agile voice. Often it can be quite light. That depends kind of on the individual approach that most singers take on. But that's the way to identify them. They kind of sit higher in the range. They sing more on their middle voice and their higher notes, and it's generally quite light and flexible. For example, a good way to think about it is if a baritone is starting to kind of add a lot of connection, a lot of power between the D and the F4, and that's where the majority of their highest chest notes are. A tenor can actually sound at ease up here, like really comfortable, part of their upper tessitura possibly. Particularly between the D4 and the E4, for a baritone they sound like big notes, for a tenor they barely sound like high notes at all, which is actually quite interesting, because even though it's a male voice, they're having to try much less hard to achieve similar pitches because their voice is naturally more higher sitting and a little bit lighter and a little bit brighter in those particular areas of their voice. A tenor's upper belt range could often reach around an A4, which for a baritone is just not feasible due to how obviously deeper their voices are, and the F and the G4 being kind of their top notes. Obviously this is implementing a mix for most tenors, but it almost seems like a tenor's mix is easier to find because obviously their voice is higher sitting. They kind of are closer to their passaggio anyway, so they have more natural feelings around that sort of area, so they can navigate it a little bit better. So it just seems to me like a tenor's voice has an easier time mixing with their head voice because kind of their chest voice and head voice are kind of closer together than most voice types. So they kind of have the feeling of the two more frequently, and they know how to mix it a little bit better. So they kind of have much more ease and power and freedom up in that A4, B4, C5 area. And as I mentioned before, those are the money notes. Another way to identify a tenor voice is by their low notes, or lack thereof. So around the D3 and a little bit lower than that, a tenor's range and voice tends to lose connection and power and volume, purely because their voices aren't as thick. They have much less practice singing at these lower pitches, and when they try and get to them, they're more like of a whisper, or they lack resonance and power and connection and a really strong chest-based dominance. Because as I say, their voices are much lighter and much thinner, so they just don't have the power required to oomph up these very low chest notes. So for example, a bass would sound really powerful down here, a baritone would sound at ease, but a tenor would kind of struggle and lose volume and power because it's just not where the voice naturally shines. They're much more comfortable in their upper notes and their mid notes because that's where their voice has much more practice. So that's just another thing to keep in mind, that a tenor's lows aren't really going to blow your socks off because that's not really what they're there for. Okay, so what's an average range for a tenor? I would personally put it at around an A2 to an A4. There are some people that think that a C5 is a really common note for a tenor, and in the classical world it absolutely is. Obviously that's the money note, that's the one that everyone's there for, the big high C. Not every contemporary tenor has this ability to hit a C5. A lot of the time, above the A4, they flip to a head voice or a more head dominant coordination, because not everyone has that level of power and oomph in their voice to get a really strong C5. That's more of a classically trained technique that takes a lot of practice to do. So for me, an A4 is a high belt. It's a good upper chest note or a good kind of mixed note for most tenors, and I'd say most tenors' range sit between the A2 quiet and an A4 really good. So a tenor's real vocal strength is in their mid to upper chest voice, and because their voice is so light and flexible and bright, they can get a lot of ease, a lot of resonance up here, and they sing in these areas a lot very naturally. A lot of times, because a lot of other voice types can't sing up here too well, that these guys have to do a lot of this practice and eventually make their voices really beautiful and really strong in these areas and really agile. Because their voices are so bright, they choose a lot of blaring vowels, like an ah vowel, which obviously can add a much more powerful, wider sound and gives a lot more space to really use resonance and hit these mega powerful high notes. Their voices sound really beautiful and really natural and really at ease here. Another place the tenor's voice really works as a real vocal strength is in the upper third octave. So what I mean by that is, for a baritone in kind of the G3 to the B3 sort of range, they're already starting to enter their mid voice and it's starting to add a bit more power and a bit more resonance, and it's starting to get a bit louder and a bit fuller. Now, as good as this can sound in its own right, and there's a lot of place for that, a tenor's voice right now is kind of still in their mid lows and it's very much at ease. So this is kind of the only voice type that can sing these notes beautifully and gently and create these lovely softer passages at these kind of slightly higher pitches for a guy's voice, and it can sound really beautiful, and it's a really nice sound, these upper third octave notes for a tenor, because they're not having to try particularly hard at all to hit them, and they can sound awesome. So those are the main vocal strengths. Another place I've noticed that a tenor's voice is really good is around their passaggio. So as I say, they seem to transition very smoothly and very effortlessly into a falsetto or a head voice coordination. This probably is because, as I say, their voice is closer sitting to their passaggio anyway, as it's a naturally higher sitting vocal. So they seem to have more practice transitioning between these gentle high notes in their chest range and these gentle high notes in their head voice. So they seem to flip effortlessly between them both, and just the sound they can create, particularly these kind of G4, A4, B4 sort of area, and they can do these coordinations and flip between them really well. It's a very smooth transition, and I feel as though these are the voice type with the smoothest go-between, like going between their chest, mix, and head voice, because it's all so close together due to their kind of more biologically higher sitting vocals. I feel like the transition is much smoother. It's the nicest kind of voice type to do these sort of sounds, because they implement falsetto really well, a lot of tenors, a lot better than some voice types do. Okay, so this is probably pretty obvious, but a tenor's main vocal weakness is in their low notes or their lower chest voice. Most of them don't practice it, and they have no real reason to. Like below a D3, a lot of tenors have little to no proficiency. Most can kind of whisper into the second octave. Their low sort of like a and that'd be like all it is, because they have no real feeling of the chest heavy resonance down in these areas, because that's not where the chest voice shines. It sits much higher and has a much more easy time doing all these higher to mid notes. So they have no real reason to have this coordination down. So I don't really blame them for that. But yeah, their low notes leave a lot to be desired and aren't exactly their best part of their range. Another thing a lot of tenors do is get overconfident. Yes, they've got a biological advantage in higher ranges, but sometimes they try and push a sound that's too big up and implement way too much chest voice around these C5 areas. And because they do have a higher voice, they can get away with it. Look at Bruno Mars. He has a great voice, but he mega chest belts are on like a D5, and he has a very, very high voice, so he can just about get away with it. But for a lot of people, they can't do that, and it'll really damage their vocal cords either straight away or in the long run, because these sounds aren't really sustainable for too much longer without mixing effectively. So as I say, a tenor's main weakness is in their vocal lows, in their lower chest range, and also when they get a little bit too overconfident with the vocals that they've got and try and hit things that are too high with too much chest resonance, because that will only end badly for most people. And I've noticed tenors seem to kind of do this a lot more than other people because they think they can, and they really shouldn't. Okay, so let's look at some subcategories of tenors. Again, there are quite a few, and we've mentioned some before, like a baritone, but let's look at three different ones. So let's first look at a leggero tenor. Now, these guys have a really flexible, agile voice. A lot of them can do really complicated melisma and loads of really interesting runs and do lots of vocal acrobatics with their voice. They also have an ability to kind of sing a lot of the time above a C5 in a more full coordination, generally with a darker chest dominant mix. Because these guys have unbelievable flexibility in the higher parts of their range, is where they really excel and what they do really well. It can also be referred to as a high tenor. There might be a slight difference between a leggero tenor and a high tenor, but a high tenor has these same capabilities in this higher range. Some can even get to an F5 in full voice, that's how amazing they are, but that's very rare. Second, a spinto tenor. Now, a spinto tenor is essentially just a regular tenor, but they have a darker tone. So they can get all the brightness and all the flexibility of the upper range of a regular tenor, but they have almost the darkness of a baritone in the high ranges sometimes, so they have the easiest time bringing weight up and adding these really, really thick, powerful high notes, which are just above what a baritone's capable of, hence why they're still a tenor. So that's a spinto tenor. And then we've got a lyric tenor. Now, these guys have a really warm, agile voice that really excel in the middle of their range. They sound light and bright and amazing up there, but they can also go as high as a spinto tenor, but they lack the dramatic weight of one. They don't bring up a really heavy, dark sound. They kind of keep more agile and lighter. But they have really, as I say, a warm mid-tone and a really, really good high tone, just without the blaring, powerful, overly big notes sometimes. Okay, so those were three good examples of different tenors. There are plenty more though, so don't worry. Okay, so where do you find a tenor in the music industry? Everywhere. Literally everywhere. If you hear somebody on the radio, they're most likely a tenor. They fit so well into contemporary music and the current music scene as it is right now that they are littered everywhere. For example, they sing all the really catchy choruses and all the really high-keyed hooks that we all wish we could sing and we all try and sing along to and butcher in the car. They have those three money notes, the A4, the B4 and the C5, which litter pop choruses everywhere on the radio and all other genres everywhere. If you were to be born with a voice type just designed and destined for musical stardom, then the best advantage you can have is to be a tenor. They are ruling the roost right now. They are the baritones of the 50s and 60s, which had all the amazing parts. Tenors are those guys. They litter everywhere. Another place that tenors exist a lot are in metal music, alt rock and metalcore. I don't really know why, but for some reason a lot of metalcore bands, if not most metalcore bands, have a tenor or a high tenor lead singer. They all do really high notes all the time, and that must just appeal to the demographic because pretty much all the bands have them. And I'm a big metalcore fan, and a lot of them have high voices. So yeah, as I say, tenors literally appear everywhere, and yeah, they're probably going to be around for some time, I think. Okay, so let's have a look at some examples. Okay, first one, look at Freddie Mercury. He has probably one of the most legendary, best, and most famous voices ever in rock or in any music ever. He needs no introduction, let's just listen to him sing. Okay, Brendan Urie, as you may have seen on my favourite vocals list, he's my favourite singer, and he has a classic baritone range leaning more towards the tenor side. Amazing power and amazing range, let's listen. Thirdly, Michael Jackson. He's known as the king of pop. He has probably the most famous, the most iconic, and the most pickable out of a crowd voice of all time. He's a very high tenor, a very, very high tenor. He sounded almost childlike at one point because his voice was so high. But again, he needs no introduction, and we all know who he is. Let's just listen to him do his thing. Okay guys, thank you very much for watching this episode. That's the most famous voice type and the one that everybody knows the most about, but I hope you learned something anyway. So next time I'm going to try and explain the mess that is the countertenor voice and explain kind of what it is and what it means. But for now, thank you for watching and goodbye.